Welcome to Creative Conversations. I'm Roger Humphrey. In this episode, I'm pleased to welcome the Emmy and Peabody award-winning filmmaker and author, Sheila Curran Bernard. Please join us as we discuss her most recent book, Bring Judgment Day, about the life and times of 1930s and 40s folk singer Huddie Ledbetter, also known as Leadbelly. He brought us such classics as Irene Goodnight, Rock Island Line, Midnight Special, House of the Rising Sun, and many more. Hey, before we begin, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. It's easy to do, and it really helps the channel a lot. Thanks. And we are welcoming to this show the wonderful writer and filmmaker, Sheila Curran Bernard. Thank you so much for coming on. So nice to meet you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I am really excited. I really want to talk about your new book. Bring Judgment Day. Wonderful book.
Thank you.
And I really enjoy it. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I've been chewing on it dutifully, and I really am enjoying it quite a bit. The story is about a folk singer from the 30s and 40s named Huddie Ledbetter. Am I pronouncing his first name correctly?
Yeah, there's no total agreement about it, but he seemed to pronounce it somewhere between Muddy and Hoodie. So, yeah.
I don't know if this is true or not. I had read at one time that his given name actually was Hudson, and that Hoodie was. Had you run into that statement at all? I've
never seen that. I've never ever. So I'm curious. Where did you see it?
You know what? I read it in an article online.
Yeah.
God, a couple of years ago, and I hate to attribute it, but I had never heard it before, and so I thought, well, I would ask. My assumption, there's so much. Well, need I say BS about this guy
yes.
that you know you don't know what to believe and what not to believe.
Yeah, so. People also often give him a middle name, William, and I haven't seen any evidence that that he had a middle name.
Ah.
So, his father's name was Wesley. So,
okay. So, tell us a little bit about him, can you? The true story.
The true story. Well, sure. I should say from the beginning, this isn't really so much a biography of him as a look back into his early days. So, what we tend to know about Huddie Ledbetter, Leadbelly, comes from how he was introduced to national audiences in the 1930s. By music collector folklorist John Lomax and his very young son at that point, Alan. And they had discovered him while they were recording music at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. And then John Lomax brought him on as an assistant while he finished doing some collecting for about 3 months in the South while Alan was ill, and then had this idea of introducing him in the North. Which Leadbelly was all for. They were both men. Lomax was in his mid-60s. Leadbelly by then was in his mid-40s. And they were both kind of eager for a next act in their professional lives. But the way Lomax introduced Leadbelly was as this singing ex-convict from the swamplands of Louisiana, basically. And he really played up that he was a natural, that he was, inherently violent, that he had done all of this time in prison, and completely downplayed the fact that Leadbelly had been a professional musician, came from a family of musicians, and I was curious also then about what was really going on with the incarcerations. He had done time in Texas and Louisiana, but this was in the post-Reconstruction South. So there's this period after the Civil War known as Reconstruction, where federal troops come back in and try to get the South to create a biracial democracy. And it only lasted about 12 years. The South really kind of put an end to it and then eventually began rewriting state constitutions to disempower Black Southerners. They lost the vote. They lost a lot of economic opportunity. And there was also this thing known as convict leasing, where states could use, they had lost the labor of enslaved people. So there were institutions put into place to basically find other ways to force Black labor. And what I wanted to find out was Leadbelly's prison record part of that process, and also a process of keeping the African American population sort of quote unquote in its place. And it really turned out that that was, in fact, there are reasons to question his incarcerations, especially him being at Angola.
Wow. Well, I'm a guitar guy, and
I
as
know.
as a young kid learning folk music in the early '60s, Leadbelly was one of a handful of names that just always popped up in the music and such, and 10, 12, 14 years old, and all you know is the name Leadbelly, and you immediately start making up your own myth about who this guy was. He must have been. He probably was, and it's really easy to go off on a tangent as a child. But I didn't realize until much later that a lot of that had been, I don't know if fabricated is the right word, but certainly embellished. So it sounded, and so I was fascinated. I was excited to meet you and talk to you about this because I've known this guy and his music. Well, I've known about his music. I've known about him my whole life, but I never really felt like it was factual. He's kind of a bigger than life guy in a lot of ways. In real
Hugely
life.
influential. Yeah, he's a hugely influential. He's an icon of the American music canon for sure. I mean, he's also a link between past and present. He influenced Janis Joplin and Nirvana and Led Zeppelin and certainly the Beatles,
Sure.
via Lonnie Donegan. So yeah, no, enormously influential, and also the music that he recorded. I mean, he knew hundreds of songs, and they're not just songs that he from labor songs or prison songs. They come from all of the cultures that were living in this country while he was growing up in Louisiana and Texas from the 1880s on.
So did he write music, or was he a collector? From
He did both, and he would adapt things and make them his own. I mean, his signature song, Irene Goodnight, or Goodnight Irene, depending on which title you use, it existed before he did, but he changed songs and made them his own. It was very fluid, which is the other interesting thing about song collecting, is that you take a very fluid oral tradition, musical tradition, and then you start to lock it down and copyright it. So, which I'm sure you're aware of is in your
Sure.
work.
Yeah. So some of the songs that for those who are unaware, some of the songs that he would be responsible for, and let's use that word, Irene Goodnight would be one, but Rock Island Line it would be another. Midnight Special is another. Was he part of the House of the Rising Sun? Was that one of his also?
He performed it. He did perform it, yeah. And also Pick a Bale of Cotton
Oh,
Fields. He didn't write Rock Island Line,
no.
but he did. But he heard it while he was touring with John Lomax, and immediately was like, "This is a great song," and he grabbed it. But even like childhood songs that you learn in camp, like Little Sally Walker, he loved singing to children. Um, Take a Whiff on Me, Black Betty. Oh,
Okay.
Black Betty, Bam Lamb. He did In the Pines, which is the one that Nirvana sang, which is this gorgeous, haunting song. I'm just looking at my list here of some of the. I mean, he sang, but he did write some. He wrote one, for example. He met the Scottsboro so-called boys, and after he came up north, and he wrote a song for them. And that's the recording where he's credited as being one of the first people to say "Stay woke." And the actual quote, he says it while he's at the recording session, and he says, that Alabama, which is where they were arrested and falsely accused of rape, that Alabama is a hard world down there. And then at the end of the song, talking to Alan Lomax, he says, "I'd advise everybody to be a little careful when they go down there. Best stay woke, keep their eyes open." So that's where that came from. Well, it's one of the places it came from anyway.
That's interesting. I had no idea at all
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. So he's come up a lot recently with the conversations about what does woke mean.
Well, I have to say that reading the book, I like to read nonfiction, and I find that some books that I've read recently, boy, I'll tell you, I spent a year on one a week ago. and but yours just you have a wonderful way of telling the story. You're a good storyteller.
Oh, thank you.
Is that I get the sense that that's something that you kind of specialize in. It's not just presenting facts, and dates and places, but literally telling the story. Is that something that's important?
Thank you. Yes, it is. I mean, my background is primarily in documentary filmmaking. And actually, I was really lucky to be hired by a man named Henry Hampton from a company called Blackside for the series, The Civil Rights History, Eyes on the Prize, which was the second season. And one of the things he had us do was read books on Hollywood screenwriting and use that to craft an archival history of the modern civil rights movement, and tell stories that brought viewers through the history and didn't just do a survey kind of talking at people, but engage people in storytelling. And after I finished working on that series, I began to do a really systematic study of what is good documentary nonfiction storytelling, looking at plays, fiction, nonfiction, films, just the whole gamut, to sort of understand what are the basic elements of a good story. And that led to, I'm the author of a book called Documentary Storytelling, Creative Nonfiction on Screen, which is now in its 5th edition, and it's been translated quite a bit, which is great. So it's not about formulaic storytelling, it's all about organic. It's not imposing the story from the top and sensationalizing it, which often happens with the cheaper sort of commercial cable productions. There's, death and dismemberment around every corner. This is really more an organic way of telling a story in a way that allows the viewer, to the extent possible, to experience it. And you never know, like, if you're doing it right, if you're telling the story of like the American Revolution, at any given moment, even though you know who won, you should be wondering, maybe they're going to, if you do it right, you can really engage people, sort of this willing suspension of disbelief, because you're bringing them through the story and you want people to feel it in their gut as well as in their, in their head.
So still creating tension.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
drama in a situation where the outcome is a pregone or
without making anything up. You can't make things up. You can't impose it from above. You have to, find ways of structure. It's a lot of is about structure.
I believe that. I think that I come from a folk music background as a kid, but I'm a classical guitarist now, retired from performing. But one of the things that I teach my students, and when I taught at college, it was the same, was that this particular piece of music does not have words, and yet there's still a story. And so part of our job is to discover that story and to be able to allow this song to unfold in a story-like way. I think that's what we, as people, that's what we respond to the quickest, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's interesting, a lot of really good writers also come up through music.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I guess I'm not surprised by that, but I didn't know it.
Yeah.
So, I have another quick question about Leadbelly, if I may.
Sure.
And this is just stupid, it's off the wall, but I have to ask anyway. Do you happen to know the brand of the 12-string guitar that he played? I know he played 12-string. Do you happen? Have you come across that?
He called it his Stella.
But
I don't know.
That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Because Stella was a guitar brand, and I actually had a Stella 12-string when I was a kid.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
And I didn't know until after I bought it that he was attributed to playing one of those. And it makes sense to me because, number one, two things about that guitar that I recall. I actually lost it in a flood about 40 years ago, but it was the first guitar I ever bought with my own money. As a kid, I mowed a lot of lawns to get that guitar. But I remember it as being, in retrospect particularly, not a particularly good guitar, well-made guitar. It was a plywood guitar, and the neck on it was pretty chunky, and it was physically difficult to play. It just really was hard to push the strings down. not just because it was a 12 string. I've played a lot of 12 strings that were really quite easy to play, but this one was just a beast. You really grab a hold of it and go, but the other thing that I remember about my guitar was that it had an amazing sound for an inexpensive guitar. I knew people who had very expensive guitars that were quite surprised at how good that guitar sounded. So I understand. I think that would make sense. All of that makes sense in the context of Leadbelly. He wouldn't have had a lot of money to buy an expensive guitar, but he would have wanted one that sounded good.
Yeah, and there, I mean, I can't definitively say what kind. I know there are people looking sort of into it. When he met the Lomaxes, he had a really beat up one. It was painted green and held together with string. But John Lomax went to New Jersey and bought a used guitar for him at the end of January 1935. So I don't know. I mean, there is a guitar of his that's on display at the Museum of African American History. So. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and there have been questions about like what kind of guitar did he get in New Jersey? Like, what was that they bought? I don't know.
Well, I'm going to make up my own story, and I'm going to stick to it until it's proven.
Yeah, otherwise. I mean, it does happen. If you listen to it, even the one that was held together with string, the sound in the first recordings that the Lomaxes made in the mid 1930s, the sound is amazing. And this was not great recording technology.
Right, yeah, by a long stretch. So
yeah.
Now, John Lomax, because the book is almost as much about him as it is about Leadbelly in many ways. And he was, well, I guess, of course, like many of us, he was the hero of his own story. But there was kind of a symbiotic relationship between the two. I mean, I found the relationship, the way you portrayed it anyways, far more complex than I had thought. I kind of, so can you kind of explain how that dynamic worked?
Yes, it's a challenging one. John Lomax clearly saw Leadbelly and his wife Martha as lesser people, and believed that their natural role would be to serve him. But on the other hand, he also really recognized how useful Leadbelly was to him as he was doing his collecting. They would go to prisons, for example, and Leadbelly could explain what Lomax was looking for when he said, traditional so-called Negro folk songs. And Leadbelly could get this thing going by sort of creating, maybe competition among the prisoners and helping them trust this, middle-aged white man from Texas to talk to them. But in the 3 months that they traveled together while Leadbelly was working for Lomax, he was never paid. Lomax doled out a daily allowance as needed for things like room and some board. And Leadbelly did everything. I mean, he took care of the car. He took care, he was helping with this bulky, like hundreds of pounds of equipment that was battery operated and always problematic. He did all the driving. He also, would draw Lomax's bath for him and shine his shoes and put out his clothes. I mean, he was really an unpaid servant in a lot of ways. And then when they came up north, Lomax brought Leadbelly's fiance basically north, and Leadbelly and Martha got married. Martha Promise. But Martha and Leadbelly then took care of this house in Connecticut. John Lomax moved them all, and Alan had joined them by then again, to a house in what was then rural Connecticut, Wilton, Connecticut, which was a tiny little farm town in the 1930s, to keep Leadbelly away from the nightlife in Harlem and the possibility that he might meet other people who might want to sign him rather than Lomax being the person in charge of his career. And he entered into a contract with Lomax where Lomax initially took 50%. This is a guy who has no experience as a musical producer or agent or anything.
Right.
But he's going to take 50%. And then soon afterwards, they changed it so that 2/3 went to John and Alan and 1/3 to Leadbelly. And the justification for it was that Lomax would be introducing Leadbelly, explaining his music to this was all white audiences.
Of course.
And also Lomax was doing all of the negotiating, the recording companies, and even before they had a contract between the two of them, it seems not to have occurred to the recording companies that they should be negotiating with the performer and not with Leadbelly. So, in some ways it's a lot about Lomax, but I also was hoping to sort of shed light on this system that it wasn't just Lomax. It was the gatekeepers at the recording companies, at the radio stations, and eventually Hollywood. It was this acceptance. The way that local newspapers covered it was quite racist and sensational, and nobody questioned Lomax's story, even about a court case that happened 5 years earlier. With a little bit of research or a little bit of skepticism or interest in it, there was more to be found. And then what happened was, so they try to build a showbiz career. It starts to flail. So Lomax goes back to the audience that he was most comfortable with, which is academics. So they did a performing tour of upstate colleges in upstate New York, and push came to shove, and it just ended badly. There was just so much resentment on both sides.
Oh, that's sad. Well, not to be an apologist for anything, but how much of that, on Lomax's behalf, for example, or even Leadbelly's, how much of that is just a product of their times, the social expectations and such? I mean, looking at that, sitting here, a quarter way through the 21st century, and 100 years later, it's pretty easy to throw rocks at people and things. But I'm wondering how much of that was just they were born with these ideas. They were, and it took something like what happened in the late 60s and early 70s to demolish. Well, I say demolish, that'd be the wrong word, but at least put a crack in that armor a little bit.
It's a really good question. I would recommend Nolan Porterfield has a biography of John Lomax that's worth reading. John Lomax was unusually old-fashioned in his ideas about race. So even in the 1930s, I mean, there had been what's sometimes referred to as a long civil rights movement. By the 1930s, you've had 30 years of the NAACP, you've had the Urban League, you've had Don't Shop Where You Can't Work campaigns. I mean, and a lot of what was happening when Leadbelly would go into Black communities and perform with performers, they were saying, you're being exploited, you're being taken advantage of. So, and people like Richard Wright was one of the people who criticized, white and Black writers at the time said, Lomax, this is ridiculous. This is a plantation mentality. So it wasn't like people weren't aware of that it was wrong then. There is a sense that, the fact that newspapers could do it, but, if you have students, Northern college students, not challenging it and using, on the one hand, they'd be thrilled by his performances, and then they'd refer to him in print with the N-word. And people were very aware that word was offensive. So, to some extent, it's about power. It's about who has the power over, there's this challenge because he did have a prison record. So if you're trying to present, it's a very complicated history. There's another book I'd recommend about this history. It's Khalil Gibran Muhammad's book, and it's called The Condemnation of Blackness. And it looks at the roots of aligning the notions of Blackness and criminality and how that comes out of the system post-Reconstruction South. And if you have a population of people in prisons who are disproportionately Black, even though the reason that they're disproportionately Black is because of white violence or white exploitation, the takeaway looks like, there's a criminality inherent, and it's a false takeaway. But, as a civil rights leader, how do you cope with that when you're coping with so much else going on?
So now this is not your only venture into these types of topics. You've done I'll Make Me a World and Slavery by Another Name. What prompted that interest, just other than righteous indignation?
Well, I've been very fortunate. I mean, working with Henry Hampton's Black Side, I worked on 5 series there. You just mentioned I'll Make Me a World, which was a history of African American arts. I did some development work on This Far by Faith, which was about African American spiritual journeys. And just they did a series on America's War on Poverty. It was a Black-owned production company, and it was, really a privilege to work there, and I learned a great deal. And then just moving forward, so the person I worked on Eyes on the Prize with, Sam Pollard, is the person who brought me on to Slavery by Another Name, which is based on Doug Blackman's Pulitzer Prize-winning book about various forms of re-enslavement in the aftermath of the Civil War. And actually, I had earlier been hired to develop a project about lead belly, and these things often don't get off the ground for one reason or another, and it didn't. And I was glad because, when I was working on Slavery by Another Name, this thing kept coming up that people were being arrested for carrying a pistol. Well, Black people were being arrested for it.
Right.
And that was the charge that I remembered that Ledbelly had been charged with. And I began to think, well, gee, what if I looked, knowing what I know now about this whole system of convict leasing and peonage and various other forms of forced labor, what could I find out if I went back into the records? And it's one of those things. It's like people who are interested in family history. Like, you start digging, and it's amazing what you can find.
Sure.
You can be reading newspapers from 1915, and you can read marriage records from the 1890s, and it's kind of addictive. So you start looking and looking, and you can find a lot.
I don't know about you. I know that whenever I'm looking up something, I find 5 other things that I didn't know, and all of a sudden it's a rabbit hole, and I go scooting off this way. It's like research ADD or something.
Exactly, and you just got to know when to stop. Barbara Tuchman, who was a historian from the previous century, a very popular historian. She was kind of the David McCullough of her time. She has some essays about writing history, and that's one of them. She said, she talked about a woman who was in an archive day after day, and this woman was going to pass away without ever sharing what was in her head. So,
that's funny. That's funny.
You got to know when to stop. There's always more to find.
So, well, in that quest, were there some things that you came across that you just really were surprised by? I mean, things that you just went, wow, I never saw that one coming?
I found out that he had a second daughter with this woman that he had known when he was a child outside of his marriage. And sadly, she had died of an abortion at the age of 15.
Oh.
So that was in the 1920s. So that was both sad and surprising because, I had the other things that when you're looking is you find things you didn't expect in terms of work other people had done.
Uh-huh.
And there was a judge in Texas, Judge Joni Haldeman, who had been looking into the Ledbelly story. She's in Bowie, where he was living under a pseudonym. He was living as Walter Boyd. And she had conducted a bunch of oral histories in the 1980s and early 90s with people who were quite elderly. And she just gave me, but unfortunately, all the transcripts were destroyed in a tornado that went right through the back of her house. But she gave me this box of 60 audio cassettes that, it was fantastic. So, I mean, you couldn't put it through a machine reader. You had to force yourself to listen because between the tornado and the fact that they were old cassettes and the fact that they were very elderly people and they were deeply Southern, trying to what are they saying? But it was, there were some really cool nuggets that came out of that, not necessarily connected to Ledbelly always, but just little things about life in the 1910s, 1920s.
Sure. So how long, kind of a stupid question, but how long did it take you to research all of this before you were actually able to put it together? Years? It has to be years.
Years, yeah.
So,
I mean, I think 10 years. But the writing was full-time the last 2 years. I was really lucky to get a public scholar award from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And then also after that, I had earned a sabbatical from the school. So I had 2 years full-time to write, which made a huge difference.
Oh, yeah. So you're at the University of Albany. Are you still teaching?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I wasn't sure, so
yeah,
that's very cool. In looking at this, I guess I have to ask in my teeny little brain here, but I'm reading this book and I'm thinking this is so operatic. This could make a great musical. I mean, this would be a great play.
Thank you. Yes, I think so too, and I'm hoping to find the right partners. So if any of your listeners out there, it takes a while to get things like that off the ground, but yeah.
Oh yeah. Some stories. I don't want to say tell themselves or write themselves, because that kind of cheapens the process. But it becomes very apparent that this is a big story, very dramatic and very powerful and compelling, and particularly the way you tell it. You tell it in an extremely, very compelling way. I really
appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, believe it or not, we are all out of time.
Oh, wow. Well, this has been lovely talking to you.
Thank you, and you too. So I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye now. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you. Have a good day.
I'd like to thank Sheila Curran Bernard for coming on the show. If you'd like to know more about her or get her book, Bring Judgment Day, there are links in the description. Weekly updates on all of my guests can be found in my blog. Just go to www.rogerhumphrey.com and hit the blog tab at the top of the page. You don't have to subscribe, but it would be a big help if you did. And as always, I promise, no spam. Thanks again for hanging out with us. I hope you come back real soon for even more episodes of Creative Conversations with Roger Humphrey.